where there was no way the executive could do anything, Washington could call out the militia. And he actually called out 10,000 militia from Maryland, Virginia, New York. It was, in fact, bigger than the Army, than the biggest force he ever led in the Revolutionary War. And he personally led it. He donned his old Revolutionary War uniform. Alexander Hamilton donned his and followed him. And so the president thinking, well, Commander-in-Chief, I guess I have to lead the militia. And they marched westward to destroy this rebellion of people who felt as though the taxes were unfairly being levied on them, which they were right. The taxes were going to try to destroy them. But this time Washington can put it down. Now, he actually didn't stay. But they crushed the rebellion. And they went through and they arrested people, blanket arrests. They searched homes without warrants. They held people without trial. All those things that the Bill of Rights said Congress and the president cannot do, they did. And they brutally put it down and made it very, very clear. Another Chase's rebellion or any more cry for more democracy, we will crush it. But it's kind of amazing to think, don't forget, this was anti-democratic. It's weird to think about right now, the president of the United States leading the troops at the front line, let alone the Secretary of the Treasury following along as second in command. Donald Trump, or for that matter, Joe Biden or any president before, and then what Scott Besson, the Secretary of the Treasury, just impossible to imagine. But they put down this rebellion. And that would be the first political issue. And don't forget though, one thing, the U.S. has always paid back its debts since this moment. That's always, 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 always. There's never a time that people do not trust the tax collection. Something to that effect. That could end, and then I can't even imagine. Since we're in the middle of a government shutdown where the U.S. is paying none of its bills right now, I don't know. So obviously this can end. Back to this, the Bank of the United States. Sometimes I'll call this the bus. Get it? Bank. Let's get it. Get it? Sometimes I'll call it the National Bank. Because both of them apply. There was no banks as we know it in the U.S. yet. And so Hamilton said, we need a bank because it's one of those implied powers, the necessary and proper clause, because the Constitution says Congress can print money, so we need a way to distribute it, to print it, to show that it has value, whatever it might be. Well, another term for a contract is a charter. And so literally the law said they'll create a charter, a contract, and this would become the first corporation. Not quite a corporation today, but don't forget, corporations are owned by shareholders. So the idea would be there would be private investors along with seed money from the United States government to build this bank. And even though it's private, the contract will lay out, so this legal binding document will lay out its powers. So it would do the functions of a national bank. It is almost an exact copy of the Bank of England, which was a copy of the Bank of Amsterdam. So it would collect tax revenues. So even though, of course, the tax revenues, the actual enforcement would be through the executive branch, the money would go to this national bank. And it's going to collect in dollars that they issue. So everyone's got to get these dollars. It will make a currency. You got to pay the taxes in dollars. And you're a business, that means you got to charge in dollars, etc. That's how currency works. And then, therefore, they would issue more currency and thus be able to control the money supply. They could cut back on currency to create more, or to drop inflation, create deflation, or put more money in circulation for inflation. The Federal Reserve does this now by controlling interest rates. Not complete control, but basically the Federal Reserve can control the interest rates for when they loan money to banks, called the federal funds rate. So control the money supply, incredibly important for running of the economy. And Hamilton talked about this. He was obsessed with finance. And James Madison, for a while, agreed with him when they were writing the Constitution. Now, of course, it's implied. Madison wrote the implied powers. And then here's the biggie. There was no banking system in the United States. So they would loan money to merchants to build banks, who then would turn around and loan money to businesses to have industry. Business can't function without credit, so you create the banking system. Loan money to banks, banks will loan money to industrials to create industry. And the whole thing is they would set up rules where, okay, it's in the charter, we'll loan money to create a bank, but to get this loan, the bank must do these things. For example, have due diligence, means be careful about who you loan money to try to avoid a big bubble. Things like that. And that is done today. Every bank, to be part of the US banking system in the Federal Reserve, and it's also called the FDIC, we'll get to it later, they must do certain things. If they don't, they could lose their license. They would lose their, basically their insurance. And so that was the plan. And there are good elements, but don't forget, this is a private business. So investors want to make money. They want to make money. They're not necessarily doing it, even though the contract says it, for what's best for the country or the people in the country. Well, that's exactly what Jefferson and Madison said. The Republican position would be opposed to this bank. The Federalists, therefore, against it. And what were the big reasons? First off, we'll have a bunch of shareholders control the economy. We're going to turn the running of the economy to the merchant class. And don't forget, this is just rich. A lot of people say, oh, I want to give money to the wealthy. Jefferson and Madison were rich, but they were planters. They had their land in humans and land, or their money in humans and land, not finance. And so when turned over to a bunch of people who might manipulate the money supply for their personal gain. So they might manipulate it to get inflation if they want to speculate. And then they could also create deflation if they want the value of their wealth to go up. For their personal gain and not the country. Which, yeah, that is actually a major concern. And it would happen in the 1830s. So, but also, it's not listed. There's enumerated powers. And nowhere does it say that the Congress can create a bank. And that why put Hamilton there? Hamilton was just like, what? Madison, you wrote the necessary and proper clause. Madison even told Hamilton we need a bank. And then he turned around and said, I don't want it. Hamilton just could not believe it. How dare you? Now let's be clear about it. Madison wanted a bank until he realized Hamilton might run it. They didn't want it. But still, it shows how, well, it shows how complex this whole thing was. It's very amusing to me. But here's the deal. Washington's influence will be key. Hamilton sold Washington on. That's what he got. Washington was for it, and so it passed. But only 20 years. That was the way it was. We're reevaluated. It has to be rechartered in 20 years. So it'll come up in, 1810. Right before a war. That's what we call it, foreshadowing. And now Republicans will be in power, and they hate the bank. So it passed. That would be the first national bank building. The exact building is still there. It's just across the street from the White House. And now it's a private bank called the First National Bank. So the bus assumption bill, the two big issues. Next big issue, do this one fairly quick, protective tariffs. And remember I told you Hamilton wrote his report on manufacturers, and he wanted a high protective tariff, which was the Federalist position. Why? A protective tariff is a tax on imports. That will raise prices on import. Actually, it raises all prices. And so these new wonder products industrial or manufactured goods from Britain, cloth, textiles. It'll raise those prices, but people want them. And so that will encourage domestic production if you raise the price of inputs. So you jack up the prices of your competitor, foreign exports, and hopefully encourage domestic production. Now, he didn't do this in a bubble. He did not just create tariffs and then hope it just kind of happens that companies will make the risky investment. Don't forget, Hamilton's plan also had the assumption bill to pour money in the hands of the merchant class and invest through business and the bank. So it was not just tariffs, because he understood one very important thing. Domestic production is really expensive. If you were to build a factory, do you know the cost to build it? It's incredibly expensive, and you need credit and loans. Investors who think you're going to make money. So when you first build a factory, any business, your highest cost will be in the beginning, because that's when you have to spend everything to build it. Now, as time goes on, costs will drop. So that was the whole idea of this. We will protect you while costs are high. And why? You want to be like Britain. Britain was just beginning the Industrial Revolution, and they were the leading manufacturing country in the world, and they were selling goods overseas. Exports were bringing in money. And here is a piece of porcelain that would become the symbol of British trade. In fact, that was a symbol of you made it. You could afford porcelain made in Britain, copying Chinese porcelain, even have the supposed to be success. Yeah, I know the Texas. I can't even say it. Success to trade. By the way, Britain would make so much porcelain, copying the Chinese, they started calling it China. Because it's copying Chinese porcelain. But tariffs raise all prices. And if tariffs raise all prices, those who aren't going to manufacture ever, like farmers, are going to be hurt, including Washington. So it didn't pass. A low tariff, called the revenue tariff, passed, and that became the Republican position. The Republican position. So tariffs alone was not Hamilton's plan. Hamilton's plan was also to give money for the assumption bill and the bank. I should add, this is President Trump's. Never really clear exactly what he wants, but part of the reason he wants tariffs is that he just doesn't have the other stuff. There's no other aid for business, just tariffs. You're going to pay 1,000% or 100% tariff on pharmaceuticals unless you build a factory. So that's where we're at. That's protecting tariffs. Last big issue. So we got the dividing lines: assumption bill, bank, tariffs. There's a war going on. To the point of view of the United States, we call this the Anglo-French War. Anglo means what country? Good guess. Britain. Anglo-Saxons were two barbarian, I want to say tribes, but barbarian groups who, trying to flee the Vandals and the Huns, crossed the English Channel and invaded Britain. Angles, Saxons, Anglo-Saxons. Angle, that's where England comes from. England comes from Angles. So they were a barbarian tribe. We're talking about 400 to 500 CE, before I was born. I'm not hard to believe. But so the French Revolution going. The French Revolution began in 1789. Storming of the empty prison/castle called the Bastille in the middle of Paris. They broke it down brick by brick. And Hamilton and the Federalists basically supported the British. So Hamilton, who fought with great courage against the British, greatly admired their system. The French Revolution, as they saw it, radical, too much democracy. But Jefferson and the Republicans supported the French. And Jefferson used to like to say, this is my revolution, copying the Declaration of Independence. That's a little bit simplistic, but the U.S. did get involved. In fact, it was French debt from paying or helping the U.S. in the Revolutionary War led to raising taxes throughout the 1780s, combined with a famine. Food prices went up, revolution. So, start out as a republic, a constitutional monarchy with the king. And then what did the French do to their king? Yeah, they beheaded the king. They beheaded the king and his wife, the Queen Marie Antoinette. Here is my Marie Antoinette doll, but the arm fell off. Poor Marie. She's going to lose her head and her arm. This is my Marie Antoinette doll, right? She was a redhead. And see how it's a Marie Antoinette doll? Are you ready? Okay. Yeah, it's a brutal doll, but she had massive wigs. Wigs were the style. Bows and tables. See one more time. I had a better one that I could actually shoot the head about 3 feet. So I could shoot it at people, but now it's just, that's not bad. But then her arm fell off. I want a King Louis XVI, but I don't have one. The thing what happened was, once that happened, a massive war ensued. But while that's going on, Citizen Genet was a French citizen who immigrated to the United States. Now, there were no immigration restrictions. And he was French. And he tried to encourage the United States to join the revolution. He went around giving speeches saying the United States should join this revolution because the US owes the French, and aren't we the country that said all men created equal? Which, of course, certainly wasn't what the Federalists were thinking. He was immediately dubbed a dangerous alien. Meaning, what's an alien? Okay, somebody's not a citizen of the country. That's what the term alien comes from. If you think alien as someone from another world, nobody ever said that until the Cold War. All of a sudden, people started seeing flying saucers during the Cold War. People lost their minds. And we haven't gotten over it. But we'll come back to Citizen Genet. He would eventually be deported by the Federalists. But to the American point of view, this devolved into a commercial war. I should add, and US merchants were caught in the middle of this. When the French beheaded their king, this greatly disturbed monarchs all over Europe, who could see their head on a platter too. And so what did they do? Everyone attacked France at once. And France actually did really well. But to the American point of view, US merchants want to trade with France and Britain, wealthy countries. The French are going to try to stop the US from trading Britain to hurt their economy, and vice versa. And that's going to lead to war on the open seas. US merchant ships are going to try to trade, yet French and the US will try to maintain neutrality. But French corsair, does anybody know what a privateer is? Has anyone ever heard the term privateer? Anyone know what it means? A privateer is a pirate, but they work for a country. So they're not just freelance. Okay, they're freelancing, but they're also working for France. They were dubbed corsairs. Corsairs were pirates in the Mediterranean. They were stopping American-owned merchant ships that were trying to trade with Britain. And then the British were blockading France to try to keep anybody from trading with France, including American merchants. They were even kidnapping sailors and forcing them into the British Navy, the Royal Navy. We'll come back to this. Here is a proclamation of neutrality. Signed by Washington, but the US is stuck in the middle. Washington tried to stay out. Now, I should add, the British blockade stopped a lot more ships than the corsairs did. But the British, or the Federalists, meaning the government, was more pro. The United States tried to negotiate with the British, and there were other issues. The British had never left forts in the Great Lakes. There were issues about them trading for weapons. Here, that area going back to the French and Indian War, there are issues. Because of this, George Washington would try to negotiate a treaty with the British to redress some of these grievances. Now, he didn't know who to send. John Jay was one of the negotiators at the Treaty of Paris in 1783, so he sent Jay. This is really unusual today because John Jay was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he's going to negotiate a treaty with the British. And the treaty that came back was pretty darn pro-British. The British never really did anything about the forts here. They continued to trade with the various tribes here. There's some issues along the Mississippi. The United States tried to make them return former enslaved people who fought with the British during the Revolutionary War, return them to slavery. The British refused. They did nothing about the blockade. So the treaty really didn't redress or really solve any problems, but don't forget something. If there's a negotiation, you're going to sign a treaty, a negotiation, two groups. The group who has the power dictates the terms. It's that way with contracts too. All of you have signed many contracts, and they're probably done in a way you don't even realize you're signing. And you've signed away a lot because you don't have any power. All of you have signed contracts. Every time you do anything on the internet, a little box you check, that's a contract. That's a legal document. Even on a Gmail account, you signed a contract to give away all your personal information. The company don't sell it and use it against you. You've all done it. Saying, I don't have any power and I wanted a Gmail. Or for that matter, any account. Any app, most apps, you got to check your box, not the contract. Whoever has the power dictates the terms. Britain had the power. The US couldn't dictate terms. So the Republicans went nuts and they accused the Federalists, the government in power, that means Washington, because he was president, responsible for foreign affairs, even though he sent the Chief Justice. He is pro-British. In fact, there's all plans to turn the country back over to the British. He's a traitor. Here's burning John Jay in effigy by Republicans. This treaty became a flashpoint. This would be one of the reasons why Washington would not run again. But while that's going on, there are other wars. And remember what I told you. They accused the British of helping the tribes here by trading with them. So these are the four big issues that divided the first political party. Assumption Bill, Bank of the US, tariff, and the war. The war, which I think kind of makes sense, would be the biggest flashpoint. The one that would cause the most inflamed passions. So, because there was war, we kind of loosely call this series of fighting in what is now Ohio as the Northwest Indian War. I know it's kind of weird to think about the wild Northwest of Ohio, but it was the Northwest. And I should add, there were a lot of partridges who fought in the Revolutionary War for the three of my relatives, my great, if it's five greats, grandfather fought in the Revolutionary War or in the Continental Army. And then they all moved to Ohio. And a bunch who fought in the Civil War for the North. But anyways, the tribes have bickered and fought all the time. They're so-called the woodland nations. But two of the leading tribes, and just powerful, great fighters, but reduced by disease, that I mentioned before, the Miami and the Shawnee, finally agreed to form a confederacy of the tribes. And these are the tribes here. The leaders, Little Turkey was one, Little Turtle was one of the Miami. Blue Jacket, got a British naval jacket, loved it. So he wore this blue naval jacket all the time. He just thought it was really cool. I think it's pretty cool. He looks pretty good. Blue Jacket, they dropped their differences and agreed to unify and stop the expansion of the United States into the Ohio River. And remember, George Washington was obsessed with this since remember the French and Indian War started there that led to the American Revolution, Fort Necessity, everything else. Well, it's called the Battle of the Wabash, but everyone's called it St. Clair's defeat. William St. Clair was a revolutionary veteran who had the militia. There was no standing U.S. Army. And they were absolutely devastated right here. Considered to be one of, if not the worst, defeat in American military history. And American forces have surrendered, like in World War II and Corregidor, Bataan in the Philippines, things like that. But this was an absolute destruction. They stumbled into an ambush. But Washington was able to use this defeat to do what he and Hamilton wanted, and they created a standing army. And so for the first time in American history, a real standing army. Now, the U.S. Army will date its beginnings to 1775 during the Revolutionary War. But that army basically disbanded after the Revolutionary War. But in 1792, the U.S. would create a standing army, always small, but a permanent professional army. Now we have a massive army. That's something that was not in American history until relatively recently, after World War II, Cold War, and now we are very much a military state. But it wasn't like that before. Created an army, took 3 years, but then they returned. And by then the coalition had fallen apart. Little Turtle Little Turtle had too many differences, and the Miami pulled away. The British kind of quit supporting. And the Battle of Fallen Timbers in upstate Ohio, U.S. forces under Mad Anthony Wayne defeated the decisive victory by the United States. Arguably one of the most important victories in America, because that's going to lead to the Treaty of Greenville. And basically, the U.S. got Ohio. But the big thing is they got that piece of land. And what's going to happen is all this area here will go to the U.S., and that's going to create a wave of settlers who are going to come in and take the land. A wave that's kind of unprecedented. Now, I should add, all this land here, according to the treaty, would go to the woodland nations, the various tribes. Anybody want to guess how long the treaty said they would have this land? It was kind of this vague. Yeah, it was never quite specified. But what they told the various tribes forever. But they never wrote it down. So how long do you suppose forever lasted? The U.S. islands. And that's going to trigger a whole series of wars. We got Fallen Timber, and then there'll be another one called Tippecanoe. So Washington ended his second term, disillusioned, tired, and he would make a farewell address. This is his written copy. It would be printed, sent out to people. And in it, he laid out two things. Avoid foreign entanglements that will lead to a standing military and tyranny. Their knowledge of history showed that war leads to the government having to get much stronger, and tyranny. That's what happened in the French Revolution. Some of you might know about the terror. And avoid partisan divide. The parties. The Federalists and the Republicans turned very bitter, and he was stuck right in the middle. I mean, George Washington being called a traitor, and then calling Thomas Jefferson a red-headed traitor. They said that all the time. Yeah, right. So this is a cartoon trying to show, here's the Federalists and the Republicans pulling the country apart with liberty and independence. And when they heed the warning of Washington, like he's like in the sky, this is supposed to be clouds. This is looking like a very poorly made stone wall, but warning the people not to do this. Avoid foreign entanglement, avoid parties, even though he was a member of the Federalist Party. Did they listen to him? Of course not. So the election of 1796 would be the first election contested where you're going to have two parties run in opposition. Adams, the sitting vice president, will be chosen by Federalists in Congress. That's how they chose him back then. And Jefferson, the former Secretary of State, he had resigned as the Republican. Now, the textbook is going to say Democratic Republicans. They did not call themselves Democratic Republicans. They called themselves Republicans. Future historians call them Democratic Republicans to differentiate them from the future Republicans. But they call themselves Republicans, so that's what we're going to call them. And here's the thing, I didn't tell you this. Remember the Electoral College? The Electoral College, the majority becomes president. Well, this is how they set it up. Every elector has 2 votes, so they vote for 2 people. Whoever gets the most votes becomes president. Second most votes, what do they become? The vice president. Do you see a problem with this down the road? They never dreamt, well, or they deluded themselves to believe there wouldn't be this partisan divide. But the election was bitter. Here's Republicans say, turn out, save your country from ruin. Down with the Tories. That's a term they gave to the loyalists fighting against revolution. Down with the British faction. So they're calling the Federalists basically traitors. And here, the March of the States, Washington leading the Federalists forward. But who's trying to stop them? Jefferson. When the election finally happened, remember, electors are chosen by state assemblies. They're not chosen by voters like today. That's how close the vote was. 71 for Adams, but 68 for Jefferson. All the Federalists and all the Republicans voted for their #1 candidate, but then they split the vice presidential. They split them. So who's second? Jefferson. It would be like Trump becoming president and Kamala Harris being vice president. So on that note, quiz tomorrow. Yeah, how? I just don't understand anything. You too.